I remember the books we used to use in my Catholic school. Okay. They were full of little mottos in the margins. Any of you remember those things? I remember one in particular, that is, Pro Deo et Patria, for God and country. I remember that being taught that being a Catholic and being an American were not conflicting concepts. Rather, that the better Catholic I was, the better I could serve my country as an American. How so? Because the virtues that come from following the living Lord Jesus Christ, faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and all the rest, love of country, the service of the common good, a respect for truth and the property of others, all these make me a better servant of the country in which I spent my life as a citizen, while making my spiritual pilgrimage as a Christian to the New Jerusalem of God. As I then understood American polity concerning the First Amendment, all of us citizens were guaranteed freedom to practice our religion, to assemble like this, and to speak freely like this, without fear of government coercion. After all, in the 50s, the great enemy of religion was seen to be international and atheistic Marxist communism. The communist Soviet Russian Constitution then in force guaranteed freedom of worship to its citizens, but not liberty to practice their faith apart from worship services in a church building. That meant no church-based schools, no faith-based hospital services, no conducting of one's personal life or business with open relation to the moral and spiritual principles that arise out of an authentic relationship with God. This was a deliberate attempt to strangle the life of believers with their God, and of course everybody in those days was aware of this. This is why I find it so strange that today I stand here speaking on the progressive suffocation of the First Amendment principle of religious liberty today. The major affront of the moment, the reason for our public assembly today, is the regulation of the Federal Health and Human Services Administration mandating the purchase of insurance coverage for abortion, sterilization, and contraception services by nearly all employers, faith-based or not, regardless of how these purchases contradict the buyer's faith and moral principles. It would be a mistake to see the HHS mandate as the only recent attempt by the current government to chip away at First Amendment guarantees. On the contrary, there is aggressive governmental action of this type on a variety of fronts. And I want to mention a couple of things here that are allied to what we're doing. Take, for example, the response taken by U.S. Army to the letter sent by the Archbishop Broglio of the Catholic Military Ordinariate. He's the bishop in charge of Catholic members of the armed forces. On Thursday, January 26, 2012, the Archbishop emailed a pastoral letter calling for Catholic resistance to the HHS mandate as a violation of the freedom of religion recognized by the First Amendment to the Constitution. It instructed Catholic military chaplains to read it from the pulpit at Sunday Masses the following weekend in all military chapels. We did it, all the bishops were doing it that weekend. The Army Chief of Chaplains Office and senior chaplains emailed senior chaplains asking it not be read at Mass, but if it was to be distributed, to do so as I mentioned in the announcements and distributed in printed form in the back of the chapel. Archbishop Broglio nevertheless affirmed his rights and eventually won an admission from John McHugh, Secretary of the Army, that it was wrong to have tried to stop the reading of the Archbishop's letter. The Archbishop, for his part, in a spirit of accommodation to military concerns, agreed to drop the following line from the letter. We cannot, we will not comply with this unjust law, as Secretary McHugh was concerned that this might be understood as a call to civil disobedience by soldiers. We have, nevertheless, in this, a clear interference by the Army at the instigation of the government with the ordinary pastoral communication between ministers of religion and the congregations entrusted to them. Now, what's the limit on this? Are we getting to the point where our soldiers cannot be instructed in the religious doctrines of their church without doctrinal oversight subject to government administrators? If you think this isn't coming, try this one on for size. In accordance with Armed Forces' new embrace of same-sex relationships, the Office of Navy Chaplains has ordered their Corps to replace their marriage training with new stuff accepting of the new relationships. Citing additional legal review, the Navy says, it is concluded that if the base is located in a state where same-sex marriage is legal, then the base facilities may be used to celebrate the marriage. This is a change to previous training that stated that, that such marriages weren't authorized on federal property. Furthermore, and this is the thing, chaplains who decline to perform these marriages will be labeled not team players and passed over for promotion. Senior chaplains will be ordered to comply and punished for disobeying, quote, lawful, unquote, orders if they resist. So much for the protection of conscience and the freedom of religious liberty, when senior chaplains will be punished for the administration of sacraments and pastoral service in accordance with their church's ancient practices. As this last example makes clear, it's not only Catholics whose religious liberties are at stake. Last January, the Supreme Court decided a case involving a Lutheran church and school who fired a minister for insubordination. The minister sued for alleged discrimination, and the Federal Equal Opportunity Commission jumped into the fight. The Supreme Court had in the past recognized an exemption from review for the hiring and firing of religious ministers. In other words, that was something essential to church good government, and something that only the church has a right to make a decision about, the qualifications of a minister. Nevertheless, the government aggressively sought to deny the constitutionality of this established exemption. They tried to completely blow it out of the water. The Supreme Court did in fact slap down the government in a 9-0 opinion protecting the ministerial exemption. Nevertheless, the government's prosecution of the case in the face of settled law, and that was settled law for 40 years, speaks to hostility to citizens' religious freedom and that of their religious communities that I find unprecedented in my lifetime. All these examples, and more I could enumerate, point to a new condition in American public and religious life. The country is growing more secular and not in a good way. When I was a child, I thought American religious freedom meant that we had a level playing field on which all Americans could build a society and live together in relative peace. We might disagree about the honors which should be paid to the mother of Jesus, or even whether one God was a trinity of persons, but we could still get the sewers fixed, provide for our national defense, and bend our common efforts to the needs of the poor and the marginalized. I fear that that situation is going. It used to be that there was in America a clear Protestant ethical and moral consensus about human purpose and virtue, in which Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and others could participate, even if there was disagreement about some of the details. We now have a culture growing in which God's existence is denied, the objective moral law and structure of the universe declared to be a lie, and religion is becoming tolerated, if at all, as a merely private hobby. This is an aggressive secularism with historical precedent both in the French and Russian revolutions, with the agenda of removing religion and religious concerns from the public life of the nation. This new American revolution is, in contrast, a quiet one that seeks to destroy its opposition by slow strangulation rather than by a bullet to the brain. As of this year, for instance, it is reported that Protestants are no longer a majority of our citizens. Well, we're all minorities now. There is in some parts a new and aggressive intolerance of any religion at all, with the First Amendment liberties for religion and religious life being reinterpreted by some as guaranteeing freedom from religion and its appearance in American public life. And the first weapon being used for the destruction of First Amendment religious liberty is the corruption of the conscience of religious people. That's what this mandate's about. This is an old practice. The Roman Empire did it against the first Christians. In an age when it was illegal to be a Christian, Christians denounced as such to the authorities were given a choice. Either offer a pinch of incense to the idol of the Roman emperor and receive a notarized certificate saying that you have, or have your flesh raked off your arm with iron combs, among other pleasures, before as preliminary to your formal execution by crucifixion or decapitation. There were many martyrs who refused to compromise their faith, but also a lot of people who, under pressure, worshipped the idol, took the certificate, and then went home to their families. But their witness to Christ and their commitment to him had been corrupted in their hearts. It was enough for the pagan Romans to encourage the Christians to compromise their commitment. If they gave in once, you see, they could be trusted to give in a second time, and even further. Japanese daimyos, in similar fashion, gave Christians in the 1500s a choice of trampling on the cross of Christ or crucifixion themselves. The secular government of Mexico in the 1920s waged war against its own Catholic population there, a forcible secularization of schools, and the de-Christianization of the national life, going so far as to hang dissenters from trees and lampposts. You can think of the Soviet gulags, or else the Nazi camps in which clergy and Christians of all times were sent for their witness to God's goodness. Names like Edith Stein, Maximilian Kolbe, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Franz Jägerstätter come to mind. In some ways, the modern secular and atheistic regimes are more systematic in their persecution of religious liberty than the old pagans ever were. But the technique is the same. Force the religious person to compromise their principles once, and you can be sure that they will compromise again and again and again. I think that the religious person remains a problem for the secular mind. Religious people are accused of being irrational, believers in myths, unscientific in an age ruled by science. The real problem is that the religious person is God's person first. In the motto in my old Catholic school book, Deo comes before patria. God before country. And this is heresy to the secular mind. It means that the religious person will always be serving a law that is higher than the U.S. Constitution, to love with a love that is higher than patriotism, and an ethic that does not seek fulfillment in possessions or power or pleasure, but in love and service of God and neighbor, with God always first. And for that reason, to fit in with the secular purposes of the state, the religious person must be made to compromise their moral and religious principles. And refusing to compromise our principles is what we are about here today. There is a sense in which we who seek to be faithful to God as we know him will always be unable to fit perfectly into this world, for God is greater than the world. We will forever be unable to quite fit with this world as it is, for this world's aspirations are too small for the truth that has been shown us. As St. Paul says to the Romans, I beg you through the mercy of God to offer yourselves, your bodies, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, your spiritual worship. Do not conform yourself to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may judge what is God's will, what is good, pleasing, and perfect. So it is before us. One of the Catholic bishops has said publicly that he expects to die in his bed, his successor to die in jail, and his successor to be publicly executed. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I imagine things will get tougher before they get better. But we can't and won't compromise with unjust laws. Martyrdom is better. We can, nevertheless, work while we can for a better outcome. That means, on the one hand, working hard at being good citizens, but first of all, committing ourselves daily to a deeper walk with God. The virtue of the God-fearing has changed the world before. We talked about it. We talked about Wilberforce. You could talk about the medieval suppression of slavery during the Middle Ages. You could talk about 1,000 ways in which the faith has brought, God's way has brought beauty, order, virtue, goodness to the world. This virtue of the God-fearing has changed the world before, and I trust will do again. But we do our country no service if we don't commit ourselves to maintaining our religious liberties. Religious liberty is the first of all freedoms, providing us the canvas on which we paint the most intimate parts of our humanity and build on that a society of authentic justice, generosity, and freedom, and that before any positive human law. The book of Genesis says that the God who is uniquely free, freely creating, and on the Sabbath freely resting, made us in his own image and likeness. Real liberty is the power and authority to do the right and good thing. License is merely the opportunity to sate one's cravings. One path is virtue, the other is vice. If you want America to be good, to be what it was founded to be worth fighting for and living in, you and I will defend our rights to religious liberty to the death. We cannot compromise them without being untrue to ourselves and to the good God who gave us life, and by his own and higher law, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of authentic happiness, which our national Constitution claims. I'd like to close. I got to go in closing, or do we have to talk? He's going to talk after your words. Then I'll close. We're almost to the end. God bless your patience.